London said, "Pull the SAS out." The order came down on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2011 from the Ministry of Defence in London, the operational centre of British military decision-making. A classified memorandum marked for limited distribution. The SAS were to cease operations in the operational theatre. They were to consolidate their positions. They were to prepare for withdrawal. The operations were to be scaled back significantly, and the personnel were to prepare to leave. This was a political decision. This was a political calculation about the sustainable commitment to a particular operation in a particular location. This was a determination by political leadership that the risks of continuing had outweighed the benefits. But when the order reached Hereford, the operational headquarters of the SAS regiment, the response was not immediate compliance. The response was not a straightforward acceptance of the political judgment. The response was a counter-proposal. Hereford said, "Before we pull out, read the body count. Look at what we have accomplished. Look at what will happen if we leave. Then decide whether withdrawal is actually the right choice." The location was Yemen. The date was 2011. The context was the progressive collapse of the Yemeni government under the weight of internal conflict and the emergence of a more organized and more capable insurgent presence in the southern part of the country. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which had previously operated as a loosely affiliated network, was consolidating into a more formal organizational structure with clearer command relationships and more sophisticated operational planning. The SAS had been operating in Yemen for approximately 3 years at this point, conducting direct action operations against Al-Qaeda elements and against associated militant groups that had emerged from the broader constellation of jihadist organizations operating in the region. The operations had been effective in the sense that they had achieved their tactical and operational objectives. Cells had been disrupted before they could execute planned attacks. Leaders had been killed or captured, removing key command and control nodes from the network. Operational planning had been interrupted. The insurgent networks had been degraded in terms of both personnel and planning capability. But there was a significant political problem developing. The operations were being conducted without the explicit legal authorization of Parliament. The operations were being conducted by the SAS as part of what was described internally as counter-terrorism operations, but were not formally authorized counter-terrorism operations conducted under specific statutory authority granted by Parliament. The operations existed in a grey zone legally. They were not authorized by Parliament, but they were also not explicitly prohibited by Parliament. They existed because political leadership had decided that they should exist. The political risk of disclosure was increasing dramatically. The risk that the operations would become public and that the government would be forced to explain why it was conducting military operations in Yemen without explicit legal authorization was increasing with each month that passed. The risk that Parliament would ask difficult questions about the legal basis for the operations was increasing. The Ministry of Defence, facing increasing scrutiny of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, facing increasing questions about the scope and nature of special operations being conducted around the world, made the political calculation that the risk had become unacceptable. The SAS should cease operations in Yemen. The SAS should withdraw. This would reduce the political risk. This would reduce the likelihood of disclosure. This would reduce the chance that difficult questions would need to be answered about the legal basis for operations in Yemen. But the SAS commander at the time had a different view of the situation. He looked at the intelligence assessments that had been prepared by the military intelligence apparatus. He looked at the operational records that documented each operation and its results. He looked at what the operations had accomplished in degrading the Al-Qaeda network in Yemen, at the scale of the disruption that had been achieved. He understood the political pressure to withdraw. He understood the legal concerns about the basis for the operations. He understood that political leadership believed that the risk of disclosure had become unacceptable and that the political calculation was that continuing operations posed an unacceptable risk. He made a decision that would prove controversial and that would ultimately result in his removal from operational command at Hereford. Instead of immediately complying with the withdrawal order, instead of beginning the process of extracting SAS personnel from Yemen and scaling back the operations, he sent a memorandum to the Ministry of Defence. The memorandum was classified at the highest levels of classification. The memorandum was not intended for public distribution. The memorandum was carefully worded to ensure it would not be leaked or disclosed. But the memorandum contained a simple and direct argument. Before you make the final decision to order complete withdrawal, before you commit to the withdrawal plan, understand what you are withdrawing from. Understand what we have accomplished. Understand what will happen to the network if we leave. Understand understand the strategic risk. Read the body count. The body count that the SAS had accumulated in Yemen was significant. Between 2008 and 2011, a span of approximately 3 years, the SAS had conducted approximately 73 direct action operations in Yemen, raids and strikes against identified targets. The operations had been planned based on intelligence assessments of al-Qaeda operational planning, on intelligence intercepts, on human intelligence reports about al-Qaeda movements, and al-Qaeda meetings. The operations had targeted individuals identified as al-Qaeda leaders and operational planners and facilitators, individuals whose roles in the organization had been established through intelligence analysis. The operations had resulted in the deaths of approximately 247 individuals in total across all the operations. Of those 247 deaths, approximately 84 had been confirmed through subsequent intelligence assessments to be al-Qaeda members, individuals whose membership in the organization had been independently verified. Another 73 had been assessed as probable al-Qaeda members based on their presence at al-Qaeda operational locations where attacks were being planned and their communications with individuals who were confirmed al-Qaeda members. An additional 68 had been assessed as possible al-Qaeda members or al-Qaeda associates, individuals whose connection to the organization was less certain, but who had been present at locations where al-Qaeda activity was suspected. The remainder, approximately 22 individuals, were individuals whose affiliation with al-Qaeda was unclear at the time of the operation, but who had been present at locations where al-Qaeda operations were being planned or prepared. The SAS commander's argument was straightforward and compelling from a military perspective. These operations had disrupted al-Qaeda's operational capability in Yemen in measurable and significant ways. The network had been significantly degraded. The leadership structure had been damaged. Key operational planning nodes had been disrupted. Command and control had been disrupted. The organization had been forced to focus on survival rather than on planning new attacks on British interests. If the SAS withdrew completely, if the operations ceased entirely, the intelligence assessment suggested that the al-Qaeda network would begin to reconstitute itself. Leadership would re-emerge from among surviving members or from new individuals brought into the organization. Planning would resume as the pressure from the SAS operations decreased. The network would rebuild itself, perhaps more slowly than it had originally grown, but rebuild nonetheless. The degradation that had been achieved would be reversed. The gains that had been made would be erased. The question, therefore, was whether the political risk of continuing operations was actually higher than the strategic risk of allowing the network to rebuild. Was it more dangerous to maintain the operations and face the risk of political disclosure, or was it more dangerous to withdraw and face the risk of al-Qaeda rebuilding and eventually executing successful attacks? The commander was arguing that the political risk, while real, was a knowable risk. The political damage from disclosure could be managed, but the strategic risk of allowing the network to rebuild was unpredictable. No one could say for certain what the network would do if it rebuilt. No one could say for certain how many attacks would be executed or how many deaths would result. The memorandum from Hereford was not a request for reconsideration. It was not a pleading petition to political leadership to change the withdrawal order. It was a statement of position. It was a statement that the SAS was prepared to continue operations if the political judgment was made that the strategic benefit of continuing operations exceeded the political risk of disclosure. It was a statement that the SAS understood the political calculation that was being made, that the Ministry of Defense had determined the political risk was unacceptable, but that the SAS believed that the calculation was incomplete and that the calculation was missing critical information. The calculation was not including the cost of allowing the network to rebuild. The calculation was not including the possibility that, if the SAS withdrew and the al-Qaeda network reconstituted itself, and then another attack was executed, the question would be asked, why did we withdraw when we knew the network would rebuild? Why did we stop operations at the moment when they were most effective? Why did we trade political risk for strategic risk without fully understanding the implications of that trade? The response from the Ministry of Defense was not a written response. The ministry had decided that the withdrawal order would stand, but the implementation of the order was modified. Instead of complete withdrawal, the SAS would maintain a smaller operational footprint. A headquarters element would remain. A tactical operations center would remain. A limited number of operators would remain to continue intelligence collection and planning operations. The direct action operations would be reduced in frequency, but they would not be eliminated entirely. The SAS would not fully withdraw from Yemen. This was a compromise. This was political leaders and military commanders finding a middle ground between the political risk of full operations and the strategic risk of complete withdrawal. The compromise satisfied neither side entirely. It satisfied the political requirement to reduce the operational footprint and reduce the political risk of disclosure. It satisfied the military requirement to maintain some operational capability and to avoid the complete reconstruction of the Al-Qaeda network. But what the compromise did not do was resolve the underlying issue. The question of whether the SAS should be operating in Yemen, the question of whether those operations were legally authorized, the question of whether the political leadership understood the scope and nature of the operations being conducted. These questions remained unresolved. They remained in the background. They remained in classified briefings and classified memoranda, and they would continue to remain unresolved until, in 2012, a journalist in Britain began asking questions about British military operations in Yemen. The journalist had received information, details about operations, locations, casualty figures. The journalist began requesting comment from the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence responded with standard denials. The Ministry of Defence said they could not discuss ongoing military operations. The Ministry of Defence said they could not confirm or deny the presence of British forces in particular locations. But the journalist persisted in pressing the Ministry of Defence for response. The journalist had obtained classified intelligence documents through sources in the government or the military. The journalist had obtained names of casualties from operations. The journalist had obtained dates and locations of operations. The journalist had obtained operational details that could only have come from official sources within the government or military. The journalist was prepared to publish a detailed account of the SAS operations in Yemen, including the casualty figures and the location details and the operational timeframes. And at that point, when it became clear that the journalist would publish regardless of government response, the Ministry of Defence made the political calculation that trying to prevent publication through legal mechanisms would be more damaging to the government than acknowledging that the operations had taken place. Trying to suppress the story would confirm what the journalist was claiming while also demonstrating government overreach in attempting to suppress media reporting. The better strategy was to get ahead of the story, to acknowledge that operations had occurred, and to control the narrative about those operations. In late 2012, the Ministry of Defence released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that the SAS had been conducting operations in Yemen. The statement said the operations had been conducted as part of the counter-terrorism mission, as a response to the Al-Qaeda threat in the region. The statement said the operations had been conducted with the knowledge and cooperation of the Yemeni government, though this claim would later be disputed by various Yemeni officials. The statement did not say exactly how many operations had been conducted. The statement did not specify exactly how many people had been killed. The statement provided broad outlines without specific details that would be damaging to the government. The response from Parliament was significant and immediate. Multiple members of Parliament raised questions about the legal basis for the operations. How could the SAS conduct military operations in a foreign country without Parliament being informed? Questions were raised about the oversight mechanisms that had been applied to the operations. Who had been overseeing the operations? What procedures had been followed to ensure that the operations complied with international law and British law? Questions were raised about whether Parliament should have been informed about the operations before they were conducted. The government's response to these parliamentary questions was that the operations had been conducted under the Counter-Terrorism Authority that Parliament had already authorized in legislation passed in response to terrorist threats. This was technically accurate. Parliament had authorized counter-terrorism operations. Parliament had passed legislation that permitted the government to conduct operations against terrorist organizations. But Parliament had not been specifically told that those counter-terrorism operations would include direct action operations conducted in Yemen, foreign military operations. Parliament had not been specifically told that the scope of counter-terrorism operations would extend to foreign military operations in foreign countries without the explicit legal authorization of those countries' governments through Parliament. Parliament had not voted on whether to conduct operations in Yemen specifically. The Yemeni government's knowledge and cooperation, which the Ministry of Defence had claimed in its initial statement, was a matter of dispute. Some Yemeni officials acknowledged that they knew about the operations. Other Yemeni officials denied having authorized the operations. The degree of cooperation was unclear and would remain disputed. What emerged from the parliamentary questioning was a more precise and much broader understanding of what the SAS had been doing in Yemen. The operations had included not just direct action raids, not just the direct action operations that had resulted in the 247 deaths, but also training operations. The SAS had been training Yemeni military and intelligence personnel in counter-terrorism techniques, in direct action tactics, in how to plan and execute operations against armed groups. The SAS had been providing intelligence to Yemeni forces to support Yemeni counter-terrorism operations, had been conducting intelligence analysis that identified targets for Yemeni operations, had been advising Yemeni military commanders on strategy and operations. The SAS had been conducting reconnaissance and surveillance operations throughout Yemen to identify targets, to track al-Qaeda movements, to map out al-Qaeda support networks. The SAS had been identifying targets for both SAS operations that would be executed by British personnel and for Yemeni operations that would be executed by Yemeni military and intelligence personnel using SAS-provided intelligence and SAS-provided training. The scope of the operation had been substantially broader than the initial disclosure had suggested. The disclosure had focused on the direct action operations, but the SAS had been involved in Yemen in much more extensive ways, providing support and training and intelligence that enabled Yemeni operations to occur. The body count, when more details emerged from parliamentary and media investigation, was also higher than the initial body count. The approximately 247 deaths that the SAS had confirmed in their internal assessments had not included deaths from operations that had been conducted by Yemeni forces using intelligence provided by the SAS. The 247 figure was only for operations that had been directly executed by SAS personnel, operations where British soldiers had conducted the assault and had fired the weapons. But Yemeni forces, armed with intelligence provided by the SAS, had conducted their own operations against al-Qaeda targets. These operations had resulted in additional deaths. When those deaths were included in the overall casualty count, when the deaths from SAS operations were added to the deaths from Yemeni operations using SAS intelligence, the overall casualty figure from operations supported by the SAS was substantially higher. Some estimates suggested that the total number of deaths from SAS operations and from Yemeni operations using SAS-provided intelligence and SAS-provided targeting had exceeded 400. Other estimates suggested the number could be significantly higher, possibly exceeding 600 when all indirect effects were considered. The political controversy grew significantly as these broader numbers became apparent. But what remained significant about the SAS commander's initial response to the withdrawal order was what it revealed about the relationship between political decision-making and military judgment. The political leadership had made a decision to withdraw based on political risk calculation. The military leadership had responded by presenting strategic risk calculation. The compromise that resulted was not a clear political decision or a clear military decision. It was a confused middle ground that satisfied neither the political imperative to fully withdraw nor the military judgment that withdrawal was strategically unwise. The SAS commander who had sent the memorandum arguing against withdrawal was, approximately 18 months later, removed from his position at Hereford. The stated reason was routine rotation. He had been in the position for approximately 4 years, which was approximately the expected tenure for officers at that level. He was assigned to a new position at the Ministry of Defense. He was assigned to work on strategic planning for special operations. It was not a demotion. It was not a punishment. But it was a removal from operational command. The officer who replaced him at Hereford took a different approach. This officer was less inclined to push back against political direction. This officer was more willing to accept the political constraints that had been placed on the operations. Under this new commander, the SAS operations in Yemen were scaled back further. The direct action operations were reduced. The training operations were reduced. The intelligence collection operations were reduced. The SAS footprint in Yemen became smaller and smaller. And as the SAS operations decreased, the security situation in Yemen began to deteriorate. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which had been significantly degraded during the period of intensive SAS operations, began to rebuild. New leadership emerged. Planning resumed. By 2014, The organization had regained much of its operational capability. By 2015, the collapse of the Yemeni government accelerated, and the humanitarian crisis in Yemen became catastrophic. The question of whether the earlier SAS operations and the withdrawal from those operations had prevented or merely delayed a larger conflict remained unanswered and unanswerable. What remained significant about the episode was not the operational outcome, but what it revealed about the difficulty of translating military judgment into political action. The SAS had made an assessment that their operations were having a strategic effect. The political leadership had made a different assessment about the political risk of those operations. The military had tried to argue for the continuation of operations by pointing to the strategic benefit. The political leadership had responded by reducing rather than eliminating the operations. The result was a situation that satisfied neither the military nor the political leadership. Years later, when questions were raised in Parliament about the body count in Yemen, about the total number of deaths that had resulted from SAS operations and from operations supported by the SAS, the government's response was to point out that the numbers had to be placed in context. The context was that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had been planning attacks on British interests. The context was that the operations had disrupted planning. The context was that the alternative to the operations would have been to allow the network to rebuild and then to respond to attacks that had been executed. The political leadership was making an argument that the body count was justified by the strategic necessity. But what remained in the classified memoranda, what remained in the internal assessments that had been carefully prepared during the period of operations, was the recognition that the operations had also killed people who were not Al-Qaeda members, people whose only connection to Al-Qaeda was that they were in places where Al-Qaeda operatives were present, people whose affiliation with Al-Qaeda was assumed rather than proven, assumed based on their proximity to confirmed Al-Qaeda members, rather than on independent evidence of their involvement. People who were family members of Al-Qaeda members, wives and children and relatives, who were present in compounds when Al-Qaeda operations were being planned or prepared. People whose death would be noted in casualty counts, but whose hostile status had never been established. The distinction between Al-Qaeda and non-Al-Qaeda, between combatant and non-combatant, had become blurred and then obliterated in the operational environment. The casualty counts that the SAS commander had provided to the Ministry of Defense made a distinction between confirmed Al-Qaeda members and probable Al-Qaeda members. But the distinction was based on judgment made before the operations began, based on assessments of who would be in particular locations. The accuracy of those judgments could not be verified after the operations concluded. The people who had been killed could not be interrogated. Their actual affiliations could not be confirmed. They could only be assessed based on the intelligence assessments that had predicted they would be present. The SAS commander who had argued against withdrawal had made his argument based on the body count of confirmed and probable Al-Qaeda members. He had made his argument based on the strategic judgment that the network was being effectively degraded. He had not made his argument based on the broader question of whether the operations themselves were justified. He had not made his argument based on the question of whether the deaths of people whose Al-Qaeda affiliation was uncertain could be justified by the disruption of the network. He had made a narrower argument. He had made an argument about military effectiveness. This distinction between military effectiveness and moral justification remained unresolved. The operations had been militarily effective in the sense that they had disrupted Al-Qaeda operational capability. But whether that military effectiveness justified the body count, whether it justified the deaths of individuals whose hostile status was uncertain, whether it justified the political decision to maintain the operations despite increasing political controversy, these questions were debated in classified forums but never resolved in public forums. The broader lesson from the episode was about the difficulty of maintaining operational control of military forces when there is disagreement about the underlying political judgment. The SAS had disagreed with the decision to withdraw. The SAS had made an argument for continuing operations. The political leadership had compromised by reducing rather than eliminating operations. But the compromise had satisfied no one. The political risk remained because the operations continued. The strategic benefit was reduced because the operations were scaled back. attack. The result was a halfway measure that embodied the worst of both positions. What also remained from the episode was the recognition that military organizations have institutional interests that may not align with political judgments. The SAS has an interest in continuing operations because operations are what the SAS is designed for. The SAS has an interest in demonstrating that its operations are strategically valuable because that justifies the continued existence and funding of the SAS. When political leadership questions whether those operations should continue, the military has an incentive to argue that the operations must continue, that the strategic consequences of stopping would be significant, that the body count is justified by the strategic necessity. This is not corruption. This is not a conspiracy. This is the institutional logic of military organizations. Military organizations exist to conduct operations. When asked whether operations should continue, they will naturally argue that operations should continue. This institutional logic can be valuable. It can provide a check on political decisions that are made too hastily. It can ensure that political leadership considers the strategic consequences of decisions, but it can also lead to situations where military organizations make arguments for continuing operations that may not be entirely objective, that may not fully account for the non-military factors that should be considered in deciding whether operations should continue. The SAS commander who had sent the memorandum arguing against withdrawal understood this institutional logic clearly. He understood that he was making an argument based on military judgment and military assessment of strategic consequences, not on broader political judgment about what was sustainable or what was tolerable in terms of legal and political scrutiny. He understood that the political leadership had different information and different concerns than the military had. The military was concerned about the strategic consequences. The political leadership was concerned about legal exposure and political sustainability. But he also believed, and stated this belief in classified communications, that the political leadership needed to understand what the military judgment was before making the decision about whether to withdraw. He believed that the decision to withdraw should be an informed decision, a decision made with full understanding of what the military assessment was regarding the strategic consequences. He believed that decisions about military operations should be made by political leadership, but that political leadership should make those decisions on the basis of accurate information about what the military consequences would be, whether that belief was correct, whether the political judgment should have been different if the military judgment had been better understood and properly appreciated, whether the withdrawal should have been halted or accelerated or continued unchanged. These questions were debated in classified memoranda and in closed-door meetings at the Ministry of Defense, and then set aside. The political decision had been made. The withdrawal would proceed. The operations continued on a reduced scale. The body count continued to grow with each operation that was conducted. The Al-Qaeda network continued to rebuild itself once the operations were scaled back and eventually withdrawn entirely. The security situation in Yemen continued to deteriorate. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen became worse, and the question of whether the SAS commander's argument had been right, whether the decision to withdraw had been the correct political judgment, remained fundamentally unresolved. No counterfactual history was ever written. No one could say with certainty what would have happened if the operations had continued. No one could say with certainty whether the body count would have been justified by preventing attacks that would have occurred if the network had been allowed to rebuild. The question remained open, unresolved, and ultimately unanswerable.